hope you are enjoying the National Oil Convention 2021. We produce energy security. Mr. Edmund Crooks needs no introduction, but for those who don't know him, he's the Vice Chair Americas at Wood Mackenzie. He's based in New York, and he's right now in New York. So thank you for being here. He's one of the leaders of the group's Commodities, Global Trends, and Corporate Analysis Research. He writes Energy Polls, a weekly column on the key developments in the industry. Before joining Good Mackenzie, he was an award-winning energy editor for the Financial Times, and he also worked for BBC News, starting as a researcher in the economics team and ending as a correspondent on radio and television. His other roles have included membership of the UK government's Sustainable Development Commission. So, thank you very much, Ed Crooks, well known to being Ed. So thank you for being with us, Mr. Crooks, and let's listen to your keynote. Thank you for being with us here in Amexi.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Thanks for that great introduction, and thank you for inviting me to speak at this very prestigious event. It's a great pleasure to be here. So I'm going to be talking today about the future of oil and gas in the energy transition. I'm just going to bring up some slides if I can, and we're going to have a look at those. There we go, just coming up now. So what we have here, as I say, is a very fundamental, radical change to the world of energy that's underway at the moment. Just if you were following, for instance, the climate summit that President Joe Biden hosted in the US last week, you heard a lot of discussion there about emissions, the outlook for emissions, which has very profound implications for the future of energy. And in particular, it has implications for a shift away from fossil fuels, including oil and gas. So what I wanted to do today is to really think about what is the future for oil and gas, what is the future for oil and gas companies, and how can those companies and the industry survive and thrive in this new world. One thing that I think it's quite interesting to do is to take a look to compare the energy industry with other industries. One analogy that quite a few people go to, which I think is a very interesting one, is the comparison with the IT sector. If you think about the way that the IT industry has been absolutely transformed over about 30, 40 years, from the era of the mainframe to the era of the iPhone, that has been something which has changed everybody's lives. It's changed the IT industry and changed a number of other industries as well, retailing, publishing, entertainment, and so on. And really, you could say that economies as a whole have been very profoundly disrupted by this change. And I definitely think there are some parallels with what's happening in energy today, and that shift in energy from hydrocarbon and fossil fuel-based energy towards lower carbon energy, which could be renewables, could be fossil fuels with carbon capture and storage, whatever it is, that shift towards all varieties of lower carbon energy. I don't think the analogy is exact. I think that there's a very crucial role for government at the moment in driving the energy transition, which is not really what happened to quite the same way in the IT industry. But I think there are also some pretty close parallels, in particular, the pace of technological change in energy, the way that costs of some key sectors have fallen very, very dramatically. I certainly think that analogy is interesting and kind of can tell us something about what we can expect in energy. One way to think about this change that we've had in the IT industry is just looking at what were the big companies in IT 30 years ago and what are the big companies today. And you can see there's just been this massive transformation. So that list over on the left-hand side there, you can see IBM, Digital Equipment, Apple Computer, a little company called Apple Computer there you may have heard of. Those were the big US IT companies at that period. And you can see that's where they ranked in the Fortune 500. So most of them not particularly significant. IBM by far the biggest, there at number 4. And then if you look on the right-hand side, you can see where we are today. IT companies absolutely dominate the Fortune 500, and some of those same companies are still around and have grown very significantly. Some of them are still hanging in there. So a company like NCR has had a bit of a bumpy ride. Things are looking up for them at the moment. They're still going. IBM, still around, still a successful company, but it's dropped out of the top 10. It's at number 27 of the Fortune 500. And you can see the companies that really benefited from the transition in IT, Apple and Intel in particular, and new businesses that weren't even around, didn't exist in 1990, like Alphabet and Facebook. And one way I guess to think about that, the comparison, you know, who really did well and who didn't. IBM's profits are about 3 times higher in 2020 than they were in 1990. Apple's profits are about 100 times higher in 2020 than they were in 1990. So you can see there's been quite a big disparity in how different businesses were able to thrive through that transition. And I think the crucial thing, and the main point I'd like to kind of flag up here about why some companies really prospered and others didn't, is that it was the companies that built the future, that embraced the future and shaped it with innovation, with products that the customers wanted. Those were the ones that really succeeded. So as I say, you could say, well, this is not a great analogy with energy. There's a lot of differences in energy and energy. Well, the government's very important. Capital stock changes much more slowly. The role of the consumer is much less directly relevant. Consumers want energy and the product is a commodity. It's not differentiated in the same way. However, I do think there are some indicators you can look at, some signals you can see that suggest things are changing, possibly in a somewhat similar way. This chart on the left-hand side here, this is comparing ExxonMobil, of course, the largest US oil and gas company, and NextEra Energy, which is the largest renewable energy generator in the US and indeed in the world. And it's the share price performance since the start of 2013. And you can see NextEra there, which is in the green, has massively outperformed ExxonMobil shares. And I think that's telling you something about what the stock market thinks of what the future is going to be. And then if you think that's extreme, then of course there's something even more extreme here, which is the Tesla share price on this scale, because the axis has been rebased there because it's just so you can see what's going on, because the Tesla share price has been so extreme, you can barely see the Exxon price in a relative sense, just kind of bumping along the bottom there. And obviously, there's a lot of things going on there. There is a very solid argument, I think you could make, to say that the Tesla share price is highly overvalued at the moment. There's a personality cult around Elon Musk and so on and so forth. So I'm not necessarily saying this represents economic reality. However, I do think it's telling you something about what the stock market thinks in terms of where the future is and the way that things are changing. So why is it changing? As I said, 2 crucial things going on. One of them is the plunging cost of renewable energy. This chart here is showing you solar power, but you get a somewhat similar picture if you look at wind or storage or some other technologies as well. The dark blue line there is the cost of utility scale solar power in the US. And you can see how that's come down and down over the past 20 years. It's about now down by about 90% from what it was in 2001. So the competitiveness of solar power has been absolutely transformed over that period. And as a result, the other line, the paler blue line, you can see going up and up and up. That's global solar installations have just kept on climbing over that period. So as I say, a bit like in the IT industry, there's been this rapid technological change, rapid decrease in costs in some sectors. There's also been the big influence of government policy. The crucial thing clearly here is the Paris Agreement, 2015. That was where 196 countries in the world, just about every country in the world, got together to commit to goals for limiting global warming. This is slightly, I mean, the full text of the crucial article is there on the slide, but essentially what they did was they adopted a kind of a dual structure where they said, we want to limit the rise in global temperatures to well below 2 degrees centigrade, and would also like to pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels. That's a very ambitious commitment. As I'm going to explain in a moment, it's not obvious how that's going to be achieved, but at the very least, it set a strategic direction for the way the world is planning to go and the way that governments, formally at least, in terms of what they're saying, what they're committed to do in terms of curbing emissions. And you can see that the goals of the Paris Agreement are starting to be reflected in individual countries' commitments to cut emissions. What this is showing is countries that are talking about or have already committed to net zero emissions by the middle of the century, by 2050 or 2060. And you can see there's just a handful of countries that are really kind of out of the vanguard here that have actually set firm goals for net zero emissions and have legislated to make that happen. UK, Sweden, France, Denmark, among those. But there's also a lot of countries that are talking about net zero goals. Of course, we had President Biden talking about that for the US last week. Canada's talking about that. A lot of the other European countries are talking about it. We have China has set the goal of net zero emissions by 2060 and so on. And then lots of other places around the world, net zero goals are being discussed. And actually this is, I mean, arguably you could say it's a little bit out of date, because one of the things this chart doesn't reflect is the statement we had from Brazil last week, where Brazil is talking about aiming for net zero under a variety of conditions, and it's related to what happens in the Amazon and so on. So quite a complex picture, but also, as I say, even Brazil now, which has been pretty skeptical of international climate policy, Brazil is also talking about net zero. Those goals are mostly for that 2050 period. What we're seeing on this slide is a lot of countries that are also talking about nearer term goals for cutting emissions quickly by 2030. I think one of the criticisms you often hear of those 2050 objectives is they are far out in the future. Governments that are in charge today won't still be in charge by 2050. No one's really going to be held accountable for whether those targets are hit or not. But what we've seen and what we saw again from quite a few places just last week, prompted by this US climate summit, you saw quite a few places announce goals for 2030, which is really, that's pretty close now, particularly given how slowly the energy industry can change sometimes. And so you see these quite ambitious commitments from the US again, the US talking about a 50 to 52% reduction in emissions by 2030. We have the EU talking about 55%. We have the UK going for nearly 60% and nearly 70% and so on. So again, that shows you how momentum seems to be building behind governments around the world, putting the pressure on to cut emissions. You'll see in that box on the bottom right, you see a variety of countries that are not pushing ahead in the same way with more ambitious commitments. Mexico clearly among them, and you'll know better than me, but clearly there's a very live debate about that issue in Mexico right now. But again, look at Brazil on that list. Even Brazil does seem to be moving in that direction of more ambitious climate action. So it's quite a dynamic picture, I think, and definitely in terms of the direction of change, the direction is moving towards more countries making more ambitious commitments. So what does that world look like? That world where countries are targeting net zero, countries are trying to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. Two charts here that will give you a good sense of that. If you look on the left-hand side, this shows you essentially three different versions of the world in terms of what happens to total CO2 emissions worldwide. The top line there, so the line going up is that's where we've come, and that's the history of emissions having increased and increased. The top line, the paler blue one, shows you what we call our base case at Wood Mackenzie. That's essentially our forecast of what we think is most likely to happen in terms of the way the world evolves. And you can see that shows emissions continuing to rise for a while and then starting to plateau in the 2030s and then dropping off fairly slowly after that. The other two lines show you scenarios, states of the world that would meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. And the dark blue line is showing you a world where global warming is limited to 2 degrees, and the pale grey line is showing you a world where it's limited to 1.5 degrees. And you can see there just what a huge difference that is. If you look at the gap, the delta between, as I say, the course we're on now, the pale blue, the most likely outcome, and the dark blue and the grey lines, which are the Paris compliant world, that's a huge change. And that shows you that it's a very big challenge. It's a very difficult challenge, but it is one that the governments of the world say they are committing to, and does imply a very different outlook for the world of energy. Another way to think about that is also showed in that chart on the right-hand side there. That's showing the average annual changes in emissions that would be required for those different scenarios. It's the same way to think about that same picture, really. But if you, again, the grey is a 1.5 degree world, the dark blue is a 2 degree world. And it's quite an interesting comparator there. The green dotted line along the bottom, that's the amount that emissions fell by in 2020 because of the pandemic. So that's saying that because people were flying much less, people were driving much less, economic activity was generally greatly constrained, CO2 emissions fell by about 1.8 billion tons of CO2 in that 1 year. What this chart is saying is, if you want to get to that 1.5 degree world, or even to extent if you want to get to the 2 degree world, you have to come close to that every single year between now and 2050. You have to have a pandemic over and over and over again in terms of the impact on emissions. So that's, again, I think a great indication of what a huge challenge this is, but it is something that the governments of the world say they want to achieve. What this means for energy then is shown in this slide. So this is looking at various different types of energy and how they'd be affected in those different scenarios. Again, same thing, pale blue, the base case, dark blue, a 2 degree world, grey, a 1.5 degree world. And just wanted to highlight a couple of things quickly here. You can see that the fourth box along, which is electricity, in those Paris compliance scenarios, the dark blue and the pale grey, electricity rockets. Essentially what has to happen, if you really want to decarbonize the world in this very radical way, you have to electrify everything. You need electric transport, electric heating as far as you can, and then you have to decarbonize that electricity. So that's basically what's going on there, a massive shift to electric vehicles and so on. And so clearly that has implications for oil and gas. And if you look at oil over the far left-hand side and gas on the next, gas next to that, you can see how oil and gas demand are very significantly lower in the 2 degree, the 1.5 degree worlds than they are in our base case. Oil in particular is hit very hard by that electrification of transport. That's a huge factor in the future of oil, is a very, very big shift towards EVs, which is really needed to get emissions on that track to meet the Paris goals. So, I say that's the broad picture. That's the energy transition. That is where the governments of the world say they're going, and that is what some of the consequences of that might be. And I wanted to focus in on exactly what that means for oil and gas. Here's another way of just presenting that same information. Really, this is looking at the outlook for oil, which is the green line here, and for gas, which is red. And the dotted line there is, as I say, our kind of our base case. That's the course we're on at the moment. And the solid line is a 2 degree scenario. That's in a 2 degree world. What does that look like? And you can see that oil demand has to drop really very rapidly, has to start falling about now to get into that 2 degree world. And by 2050, it has to be 62% lower than it would have been in our base case. Gas demand, a bit more resilient. You can make the case for gas replacing coal for power generation as a way of cutting emissions. You can also make the case for gas as being a fuel for power generation when combined with carbon capture and storage. You can also, there are also some uses for gas in terms of heating and some industrial uses and so on. Gas is harder to replace. So one of the important conclusions, I think, of this analysis and the way we think about the world in this Paris compliance scenario is that gas is more resilient than oil. Oil is much more under pressure than gas, but both are under pressure, certainly, and gas is going to be squeezed as well as oil. So how has the oil industry been reacting to that? I think broadly speaking, we've been thinking about this in terms of two approaches, quite a sharp kind of bifurcation in the industry between what you might call the big energy approach and the big oil approach. The big energy really is what we're seeing, particularly from the European majors. It's BP, Shell, Equinor, Total, and others are really kind of going down this route. And that's to say that they need to diversify. They've been setting goals for net zero emissions, typically by 2050, so very much aligned with what European governments are saying. And to varying degrees, they're saying we're going to be taking the revenues from our oil and gas business. We're going to be taking that cash flow, we're going to be harvesting it, and we're going to be recycling it into new energies of various kinds. And you've seen great flurry of acquisition activity, these companies buying EV charging companies, solar companies, they're pushing into offshore wind. A lot of different renewable energy technologies are really the thing that this kind of big energy model includes. On the other hand, you're seeing a different approach from the US IOCs, from Chevron and from ExxonMobil, and you're also seeing that generally from the NOCs, which is rejecting that approach and saying, we're going to stay as big oil. They say, we don't particularly have anything to add in renewable energy. We don't have any competitive advantage in the power business, for instance. We're going to stick to what we know, which is oil and gas. And they've generally not set goals for net zero emissions. They do have generally targets. A lot of the American companies, including the US E&Ps, have set targets for cutting what they call scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, which is from emissions from their own operations and from the energy they buy. But they're not setting goals for scope 3, in other words, the emissions created by the use of their products when the oil and the gas are consumed. Much less diversification into renewables and other new energies. We're seeing a little bit. Chevron, for instance, earlier this month announced a move into offshore wind and so on, but nothing to anything like the same degree as the European companies are moving. And when these companies are thinking about decarbonisation, in particular, they're usually thinking about decarbonising oil and gas and finding various different ways, particularly through carbon capture, use and storage, to cut the emissions from their traditional core oil and gas businesses. Quick word on then the big energy model. I mean, this transformation that we're seeing among the European oil majors really is very significant in terms of the way they're changing. What this chart shows is, you can see it's from 2020 out to 2036, and then the axis is gigawatts of renewable generation capacity that they are planning to have by that year. And it's for the leading European energy companies. And so you can see companies like BP in there, Total, Equinor, Eni, big European oil companies. And they're kind of very much on a par with some of the companies that have come from a power background, with NL, EDP, RWE, and so on. And so it's showing how they're really kind of moving into that same space, very much moving away from being strictly focused on oil and gas into becoming broader energy companies. And of course, one of the most interesting ones, arguably, there you could say, is Ørsted from Denmark, which, if you remember, that used to be a purely oil and gas company. Its name used to be Dong Energy, Danish oil and natural gas. It diversified into power, into offshore wind in particular. Now, more recently, it's been one of the biggest investors in offshore wind. And then they went and sold their oil and gas business altogether, and now it's purely a power company. And over time, probably not within the time scale that we're looking at in this chart by 2036, but eventually you can imagine maybe BP, maybe Total, maybe Shell will go that same way and would abandon their oil and gas businesses altogether. And certainly, I mean, BP has been one of the most ambitious in terms of the pace of this transformation. They're already talking about selling assets, reshaping their portfolio in order to have resources to recycle into renewable energy. Not everyone's moving at the same pace. And as I say, I think realistically, probably all of these companies are still going to be producing some oil and gas by 2050. But you can see just how significant the changes are. The other model is big oil. And as I say, companies that want to stick with what they know, not branch out from that, and not diversify into renewable energy. Now, it's important to remember these companies absolutely have a future as well. It is not essential to diversify if you want to survive. If you remember, if you go back to that chart I showed earlier, even in that 2-degree world, there is very significant demand for oil and gas, even in 2050. There is at least 3 decades when people are going to be still consuming large volumes of oil and gas, and very likely beyond that as well. And companies are going to be needed to meet that demand. However, it does look likely to be what you would call a demand-constrained world. I think one of the important conceptual frameworks that a lot of people have had in thinking about this is to think about, I mean, it's been nicely put as an age of abundance. In other words, resources are abundant. We have more than enough oil and gas in the world to greatly exceed the amount that we're able to consume while keeping the climate at a level that we want to keep it at. So it's a big contrast to, let's say, the 2000s, when there was, the first decade of the 21st century, a lot of talk about peak oil. There's a sense that oil is running out, not going to be any more of it, and so on. I think now there is a general understanding that that approach was fundamentally flawed. I think in particular it was refuted by the US tight oil revolution. People saw that there's actually a lot of oil in the ground. You just need the right economics, the right technology to get at it. And I think that's a general principle which is going to hold good for decades to come. So the issue is not supply, it's not supply constraints, it's demand constraints. The issue is going to be, is there demand for the oil and gas that companies want to produce? And in that demand constrained world, the crucial issue is going to be cost. For everyone who wants to sell oil and gas, the question is going to be, are you able to sell at a competitive cost in that demand constrained market? And lots of implications for that. I'm not going to go into all of them now. We can maybe discuss that in the Q&A, but one of the crucial issues there is to think about the future of exploration. So in a sense, you could say on a purely, in terms of purely counting the barrels, we don't really need any more oil exploration. We've sort of got enough discovered resources already to meet that demand for oil that there will be, certainly in a 2-degree world. To be Paris compliant, we should not be exploring, or we don't need to be exploring for any more oil. However, if you look at this chart here, which this is the green bars are oil and the red bars are gas, this is comparing development costs. This is average point forward development costs for different types of resources. And you can see, as I say, oil at the top, gas underneath, and the final bar in each of those is exploration. So the lowest bar for oil is oil exploration, lowest bar for gas is gas exploration. What this is telling you is that under certain circumstances, exploring for oil, and even more so exploring for gas, can be lower cost than developing known resources that you have already discovered. There is going to be a constant struggle to find lower cost resources, the most competitive barrels that can displace higher cost barrels in this demand constrained world. And so that's going to be a very important development to watch, and that's going to be one really important issue for oil and gas companies in the future, is how they can make sure they are the lowest cost producers in what will be a very competitive market. The other thing I think that oil and gas companies are increasingly having to think about, and you can see this in terms of we're having pressure from customers about this, we're having pressure from regulators, some governments are putting in regulations and so on. It's the question of the emissions intensity of their oil and gas production. It's something we've had a lot of interest in this. With Mackenzie, had a lot of interest in this from our clients. This is one of those subjects that everyone wants to know about. And so we've actually put quite a lot of effort into modeling it. And we've been developing something that we call the emissions benchmarking tool, which is a way of looking at the emissions that come out of oil and gas assets down to quite a fine level of granularity, looking at particular fields, particular wells, and so on. And what we've done with that is that chart you can see on the left here is comparing, this is one very simple thing it's possible to do with that tool. We've compared the emissions intensity of different exporters of crude into the US. And you can see there very, very wide variation. And Venezuela right up, well, Venezuela at the bottom in the sense of it's the worst, in the sense of it has the highest emissions intensity, because of course heavy oil in there has very high emissions associated with its production. Iraq, also very high, in particular because of the flaring issue there. They have a huge flaring problem in Iraq. You can see Mexico not doing too badly there. It's sort of just about below average in terms of exporters to the US. But the best performers by some distance are Saudi Arabia and the deep water Gulf of Mexico in the US, which are the lowest emissions sources of oil used in the US by some distance. And it's our sense that's going to become increasingly important. That is going to increasingly become a competitive differentiator. It's going to be a differentiator for customers that want to buy lower carbon fuels, for governments that are going to be demanding lower carbon fuels through regulation, and also for investors. And investors are often going to want to know that they are investing in lower carbon oil and gas production when they continue to invest in oil and gas production, which is leading a lot of companies to be proactive and to step forward and take steps to manage their carbon emissions. This is an announcement many of you may have seen. This came from Exxon last week, and this is their proposal for a carbon capture and storage hub on the Houston Ship Channel. And if you can see there, sorry, it's not a huge chart there, but you can see roughly what's going on, hopefully in this schematic diagram which they produced. But basically the idea is that you would collect the carbon dioxide emissions from a wide range of different companies, different facilities, from petrochemicals, from power generation, cement, whatever else it might be, all the different facilities that are there. You would combine them in a hub and then pump them under the Gulf of Mexico, under the seabed, for long-term storage where they'd be locked up there. The argument for this, and the reason why it seems like quite an exciting idea, and a lot of people have been taking it quite seriously, is that carbon capture is clearly an essential part of the overall strategy for cutting emissions. If we're serious about reaching those Paris goals, we're going to continue to need oil and gas, we're going to continue to need fossil fuels, so we're going to have to find something to do with the emissions, and that's going to mean carbon capture and storage. Without carbon capture and storage technology, we don't really have a path to the Paris goals. So it's an essential technology, but it hasn't been massively successful. Technology is well known, technology has existed since the 1970s, but it's been very difficult to scale it up. We've had a lot of pilot projects, and some have been successful and some less so, but it hasn't made the leap to anything like the kind of scale that would be needed. And so that's why this idea from ExxonMobil is very significant, because it's a way of saying, how can you jumpstart this technology? How can you take a big leap forward? And it's the kind of thing where you could imagine that would not just be this hub around Houston in the Gulf of Mexico, but there would be dozens of these around the world. and it would be a way to really get carbon capture and storage technology to a large scale. It is, of course, very expensive. That's the big catch. Exxon is saying it would need something like $100 billion of investment by the public and private sectors in order to bring this project to full scale. So that's clearly an enormous challenge. But as I say, if you want to get serious about cutting emissions, something like this is going to be essential. And I think the interesting thing from the industry's point of view is this is something where Exxon is really being proactive. They're taking the lead on it. They're saying, this is an issue, this needs to be addressed. This is something where we can bring our own expertise. We have value we can add to this. Exxon already captures and sequesters quite a lot of carbon around the world. It's the biggest store of carbon dioxide already. So this is a technology, or second biggest, but one of the biggest. So this is already a technology they know pretty well. And they're saying, well, this is the way the world wants to go. This is what the governments of the world say they're committed to. We can play an important role in that, and here's how we can do it. So I think, as I say, for that reason, in particular, this is a really interesting proposal. So final thought, answering my question, how can oil and gas companies thrive in the energy transition? I think there are clear parallels with the IT revolution. It's not a perfect parallel, but there are definitely similarities you can see. And I think governments, customers, investors, and investors probably is a crucial one I probably haven't talked enough about, but investors are very important here in terms of where they want to deploy capital. If you've seen announcements from the big US banks, for instance, just in the past couple of weeks about sustainable financing, about how they want to shift their lending and investment towards low carbon energies. This is a very important factor in the industry. So the industry is moving very dramatically, and companies are going to have to respond. The good news for the oil and gas industry is that oil and gas are still going to be needed for decades to come, but the companies that are able to survive, the industries that are able to survive in this new world during this energy transition are going to have to be able to be highly competitive on costs and probably on carbon as well. And to go back to that analogy with the IT industry, it's the companies that are proactive, that take decisions to shape the future themselves rather than waiting for it to happen to them. Those are the ones that are most likely to be successful in this new world. So those are my thoughts. I don't know if anyone's got any questions or anything else you'd like to discuss.
Yes, thank you so much, Ed, for your keynote. It is very interesting, and yes, we have some questions from the audience. So I ask to the people that is here with us that if you have a question, please put it in the chat. And we have some questions now. I could start with some questions about energy security. As you know, our convention is called We Produce Energy Security, and I would like to ask you, what is your vision of this concept?
So I think energy security, I think it's Winston Churchill who said the essence of energy security is diversity. And I think that's absolutely right, that energy security crucially means sourcing your energy from a wide range of suppliers and a wide range of technologies, and not being too dependent on any one source in any sense. I think that's absolutely right. I think it is interesting, though, to see the way that the debate is changing sort of in concert with this discussion of climate change and issues about decarbonisation and trying to drive down emissions. Because I think one of the things that a lot of people are identifying now is that the oil business, of course, is global. It is entirely international. It absolutely relies on international trade routes being open. It relies on many, many producers around the world being able to continue producing. And that is something that I think many people see as a vulnerability. And I think it's interesting to think in particular here about China. And I think when you look at what's happening in China, China, of course, by now is by far the world's largest importer of oil. It overtook the US maybe about a decade ago. Of course, what's been happening is that China's oil consumption is going up and up and up and up, and its production has been stagnating, drifting down a little bit. And the US, of course, has had its boom in oil production while its consumption has been pretty flat. And so I think for China, as it thinks about its own energy security and it thinks about its place in the world and its reliance on other countries for absolutely crucial part of its economy. Oil, of course, is what makes everything run. I think China is definitely thinking about how to address that vulnerability. And they are thinking about, certainly on the oil side, obviously they've been, as is well known, building up their strategic reserve stockpiles of oil. Chinese companies have been going around the world trying to sign deals for oil supply and so on, investing in oil production in other countries and so on. I think there are limits to that. I think the thing to watch for, and I think the thing that's going to be very interesting to see over the next years and the next decades, in fact, is whether China decides that it is too reliant on oil and therefore is going to have a really big push into electrification of transport in particular, everything that needs to be done to cut oil imports. And I mean, this is something we've been looking at with Mackenzie. We've done a big piece of research. If you look at China's share of global oil production compared to China's share of global battery production or share of battery raw materials, lithium, share of processing of those materials and so on, in all of those other new energy industries, China's market share is much greater than it is for oil. And so it does look likely that China is going to put increasing emphasis on electric vehicles, other domestic sources of energy, not necessarily great for the climate because it could include coal as well, but renewable energy, nuclear power as well. And I think that's going to be an increasingly important trend to watch, as I say, for the future. And I think, so to bring it back to your original question, what does security mean? I think it means diversity. I think that is a crucial part of it. But I think there are definitely economies that feel they do not have enough diversity in terms of oil in particular. And I think that's going to be a very important issue to watch.
Thank you, Ed. Thank you for your answer. Here we have a question, and it says, oil and gas sector is very traditionalist to adopt new techs. How to reduce time? And I would add, do you think the oil and gas sector is very traditionalist to adopt new techs? You were talking about the carbon capture storage technology. So that's very interesting. Do you think it is traditionalist and to adopt new techs?
I think it varies from place to place and from company to company. I think that one can think of times when the oil industry has been very quick to adapt new technology. If you think about US tight oil, the first breakthrough in that, really the first successful US tight oil horizontal wells were drilled in about 2008, 2009. And by 2011, production was absolutely rocketing. So there are times when, if you have the right infrastructure in place, the right skill set, the right equipment available, the right commercial incentives, the industry can move very quickly. And I think it's been very interesting. It's fascinating. I don't know if you have or how many people have been in Houston recently, but my perception of the sort of, just the conversation. When you talk to people informally, you go to a bar or a restaurant, you're kind of chatting about the industry and the future of the industry. People are really much more focused on the energy transition than they were even a year ago. Certainly they were 2 years ago or 5 years ago. And everyone is kind of thinking, what are the opportunities for us? Where is profit to be made? What could we do usefully to exploit the skills, resources, the competitive position that we've got? How can we leverage those in order to profit from, make a successful business in the energy transition? I think I would say that question is being asked much more than the answer is being found. I think it's not entirely clear yet. It's a very fluid situation. There's a lot of uncertainty around it. I think people don't exactly know what the right way forward is going to be. And I think definitely that's something when you talk about, what's holding back the adoption of new technology in oil and gas. I think certainly one of the issues is uncertainty, uncertainty about where the technology is going exactly, uncertainty about what the policy framework will be and so on. So as I say, it's not that the industry is all kind of set on this course towards low carbon, but it is definitely the case that everyone is thinking about it. Everyone is discussing it, as I say, trying to work out where the opportunities might be. And I guess that's you could call that a positive sign then in terms of the industry's flexibility and its ability to adapt to changing circumstances and its ability to adopt new technologies. That's certainly there. And I think people will move. Certainly in the US industry, they will when the conditions are right.
And what about the NOC's vision, particularly in those countries, in those developed countries that wants to meet the Paris Protocol? What do you think about the role of the NOCs?
Yes, well, I think to generalize it more broadly to the NOCs in all countries, and not just developed countries, and not just places that are committed to net zero goals and so on. I think the crucial thing is going to come back to this issue of cost competitiveness. It is, if you are Saudi Aramco, to take just an example, you are sitting on a vast reserve of oil that can be produced at extremely low cost. And this is something, I don't know, there was a very interesting interview that Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, gave to Arab News, I think yesterday, where he was talking about this, where essentially he was saying, in this world of declining demand for oil, basically their vision is that other suppliers are going to drop out. So, I mean, he said, I think, the US is producing more than 10 million barrels a day at the moment. It'll be producing 2 million. Russia's production will go right down. All those competing producers in this kind of Saudi vision of the world, all those competing producers will drop off, and Saudi Arabia will be left as one of the last producers standing because its costs are so low, because it can be competitive. Now, I'm not going to give a judgment on exactly whether that's right and whether Saudi Arabia is definitely going to be the last remaining producer. But I think the Crown Prince definitely put his finger on something which is absolutely right, which is that cost competitiveness is going to be key. And as I say, if you think about this kind of world, the Paris compliant world of maybe 35 million barrels a day of global oil demand in 2050, that implies 30 to 35 million barrels a day of global oil supply. that implies a lot of today's supply won't be there anymore. And so the question of working out exactly who has to drop off is unclear, but I think my personal view is that cost is going to be crucial determinant. And people sometimes talk about, political kind of ideas. So people say, well, I mean, as you say, when you think about developed country NOC, so you think about, let's say, Equinor or something like that in Norway, where maybe Norway would decide to stop producing oil, even though it's economic. They would say, we should just stop producing it and make our contribution to emissions reductions that way. I find that unlikely personally. I think it's very difficult for any country just to say we're going to stop producing if it's such an important source of revenue, such an important source of employment and investment. I don't think really that's going to happen. And even if you look at the US again as a comparison, if you think about the Biden administration and what they're talking about, they're talking about being very committed to emissions reductions goals, but they're not talking about shutting down US oil production. But, there's nothing. There was, I don't know if you remember, but during the US election campaign, there was talk about banning fracking, which I guess pretty well amounts to a shutdown of the US onshore oil and gas industry. And there's actually nothing like that out of the administration. They're not banning fracking. They're not going to. And so I think if countries are not going to voluntarily make the decision to stop producing oil, that's going to have to, the adjustment is going to have to come some other way. And that's going to be through the price mechanism. And that benefits the low cost producers.
Very interesting. Thank you so much. I think we can make 2 more questions. Gonzalo Monroy is questioning, what are the effect of prices, especially in the electrifying effort? Going up, going down?
Sorry, prices in the electrifying of?
Because I think that you said that the prices are decreasing in the prices of the electricity are decreasing, and in the other side, the companies have to be competitive in terms of costs. So that's quite a challenge, don't you think?
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, I mean, it is very difficult. As you say, it's a challenge, and it's a challenge that not every producer is going to be able to meet. But I don't really see the alternative, to be honest. I mean, as I say, given the competing technologies, renewable energy, and I guess most directly competitive for the oil industry then is the cost of electric vehicles and batteries, which are a crucial part of the cost of an electric vehicle. That competition between electric vehicles and internal combustion engine vehicles, the price of the electric vehicle is going down and down and down all the time. You have big manufacturers, GM, Ford, Volkswagen, talking about launching many more electric models. That is going to chip away at oil demand. That is going to put pressure on oil demand, whatever happens, and that is going to mean that oil producers are going to have to try harder to compete.
Yeah, and let's go with the last question, and I think that the previous comments led us to this one. Anna Samad, tell us. You did mention that exploration will still remain relevant in the era of abundance, and cost is a determinant factor. Do you foresee the role of digitization in driving cost further?
Definitely, yeah. I think that's got to be part of it. I mean, I think there's been a lot of hype about digitalization. I think sometimes the reality hasn't lived up to the hype when you look at the actual savings that have been achieved, but still, compared to any other industry, compared to manufacturing, perhaps, the most directly relevant comparator, just pushing forward with the industrial internet, everything that can do, pushing ahead with automation, robotics, all of those things that come with digitalization, over time, unmanned platforms offshore, for instance, many fewer people needed to operate a rig onshore, all those kind of things. Over time, yeah, I definitely think that is going to be a very important part of keeping the industry competitive and keeping driving those costs down.
Okay, maybe we can end your participation, Ed, with maybe with reflection about the Mexican hydrocarbon sector. If you can share with us like a general reflection about our sector here in Mexico.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think I'm not going to get into the specifics of policy or anything, but I just want to really, I guess, reiterate what I've been saying before, which is that we're in a world of abundance. We're in a world where it's not about competition for resources, it's about competition for capital and competition for markets. And when you're in that world, things are very important. Costs in general, fiscal terms, very important, regulatory certainty, being able to attract investment, all of those things are absolutely crucial. And I think, as I say, I'm not going to get into a kind of particular discussion about Mexico and policy there and so on, but those would be my pointers to any resource-rich country, anyone that has oil and gas that they want to be developed for decades to come, to be part of that continued supply that will be needed to meet the continued demand. You do have to get all of those things right.
Well, it's been interesting to have you and to have your keynote in our oil convention. We really appreciate your time. Thank you, Ed, and thank you to all of the people that are with us. I hope you continue to enjoy the National Oil Convention 2021. We produce energy security. Thank you all.
Thank you very much. Thanks so much for having me. Great to talk to you.